My first memory of all of this is being 7 years old in Wahoo, Nebraska, living out on a farm. And we were coming home from school one day. My mom obviously had to drive 3 miles into town to get us. And as we were driving home, she said, "Now you kids can't play outside today." And we're like, "What? Why?" And she goes, "Because there's a murderer on the loose."
There are people in Nebraska who cannot quote Willa Cather, who cannot quote William Jennings Bryan, who cannot quote George Norris, who cannot quote Bob Devaney or Tom Osborne, but they can all quote Charles Starkweather because he is their hero.
We've seen this situation in modern times with girls her age who are suffering from trauma and who cannot react or don't feel that they have choices because there's someone with a gun to their head.
And to those of you who are watching, I've spent a half century in the courtroom, and I suspect that I could take most of you and grill you for 17 hours, and by the time I was done, you would admit to the Brinks bank robbery or the Lindbergh kidnapping. Caril Fugate admitted to nothing because she was innocent. We're going to tell you things you've never heard before. We're going to give you information that you don't have. And some of you think you know the whole story. I promise if you listen and watch, you will learn. Liza, we have some things to tell them, don't we?
We certainly do.
Hi, I'm John Stevens Barry Sr. I'm a lawyer in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm here with Liza Ward. Liza lives in Massachusetts with her husband and children, and she is a professional writer. And we have a number of mutual interests. And we are both very interested in Caril Fugate. Caril was a victim, witness, during Charles Starkweather's murder spree. She was held against her will, and people still say, why didn't she escape? She did escape. She ran from him. Caril Fugate, 14 years old, ran from a guy with a shotgun, ran to a police car, said, "That's Charles Starkweather, get him." And of course they arrested her, prosecuted her, convicted her, and sentenced her to life. Of course they did. A 14-year-old girl. This is pre-Miranda, and of course they grilled her for 17 hours without a policeman. And to those of you who are watching, I've spent a half century in the courtroom, and I suspect that I could take most of you and grill you for 17 hours, and by the time I was done, you would admit to the Brinks bank robbery or the Lindbergh kidnapping. Caril Fugate admitted to nothing because she was innocent. Charles Starkweather admitted that he had done all of the killings. Finally, even though Miranda wasn't here, after they had locked her up in a mental institution, after they had made her watch women undergo shock treatments, then grilled her further, somebody decided, well, gee, maybe we ought to appoint a lawyer for this 14-year-old girl. So they did, but the lawyer would be appointed in a day or two. So the sheriff, Merle Karnoff, said, well, do you want to see Charles Starkweather? She said, no. I never want to see Charles Starkweather again. And he said, then you have to write him a note. saying you don't want to see him. So she did. And they gave it to Charles, and he changed his story. And on his way to the electric chair, he was convicted. He convicted her. On the way to the electric chair, he convicted her, the only witness who could convict her. And during this period of time, the judge, Harry Spencer, was counseling with the prosecution after each day, telling them how to get a conviction. How do I know that? Because Paul Douglas, who was one of the prosecutors, told me. The main prosecutors were Elmer Scheel, who was awarded with a judgeship, and Dale Farnbrook, who was awarded with a district judgeship, and then got to go to the Nebraska Supreme Court. The people who railroaded Caril Fugate all got rewards by being judges. Well, what happened to the 14-year-old girl? Well, she turned 15. And on her 15th birthday, they let her scrub her jail cell. That was for her 15th birthday. People from all over the country wrote her letters and sent her Bibles. And the sheriff's wife got them and told her nothing about them and showed her none of them. I got possession, and Liza has possession through a long period of through a process that I'm not going to go into right here, but I may later. There are people in Nebraska who cannot quote Willa Cather, who cannot quote William Jennings Bryan, who cannot quote George Norris, who cannot quote Bob Devaney or Tom Osborne, but they can all quote Charles Starkweather because he is their hero. She was such a good prisoner that they had her going in town. They just say they'd take her into town, she'd help people, she'd do good works, let herself back in. Eventually she was paroled. The first person to try to get her pardoned was James MacArthur, and they just said, "You've been given enough of a break by being paroled." They shut her off. I asked James MacArthur to come onto my radio show, which I had at the time, a call-in talk show. James did, and to our astonishment, Caril called in, and she talked with us for a couple hours. And we went right over the commercials. We went past our time, and she came on the second night. And the tapes were taken to an Omaha station and heard. Someone on the staff at KLIN at the time was not happy with the publicity I and my show were getting. So he taped a high school football game over those tapes. But they continued to exist because some of my listeners taped shows. That is the background I'm going to give you before I introduce you now to Liza. And I want to tell you something about Liza. Charles Starkweather murdered her grandfather, a very prestigious man, very successful businessman. He had just come from meeting with the governor. Murdered him, murdered her grandmother, murdered their maid. Something that has stayed with Liza. And Liza is here today. She's going to tell her own story. But one last thing, Liza, I want people to know that you wrote an excellent novel. It's called Outside Valentine. It's a fictionalization of the Starkweather murders. I have here a Tin House True Crime magazine, and in it I have an article by Liza which begins, "The producer from the crime show called me out of the blue and said, 'Did you know they've discovered that trauma can be inherited?' think about that. I have one other book in front of me. It's my book about Caril Fugate. It's called The 12th Victim. I co-authored it with Linda Battisti. Liza read it, and that is one of the ways we became acquainted. Well, Liza, I've given quite a prologue here, and you've been very patient, and so have been the people who are watching this, because they want to know about you. I've told them you're a professional writer. I've told them a little bit about your family history, but there is so much more. And you told me something yesterday. You told me that my quest for justice for an innocent Caril Fugate, who is still alive and for whom I am still advocating, is part of a much larger scene. It goes beyond Caril. And so, please, it's time for you to talk, and I want you to give your own introduction, and then let's just go back and forth and film it. I know you well enough to know that you can ask me as many questions as I can ask you, so please.
Well, thank you. I'm really happy to be here and talking with you. I, as the granddaughter of Lower and Clara Ward, I never knew anything about them because my father was in such pain about what had happened back there in 1958 that they were very erased from my childhood. And I only knew that a very bad man had killed them. So all of the research that I did was secretive and on my own. And the only books that I read as a child, the only things that were available to me were books that had been written in the 70s, and many of the points of view adopted by the authors were from the perspective of Starkweather himself. And so, for example, my grandparents, while they lived in a very nice house in Lincoln, in no way was it a mansion, though one author described it as such. And so a myth is born about something, and that's all I had to go on for a very long time because no one would tell me anything about my grandparents. So I wrote my own novelization, fictionalization about dealing with the repercussions of this crime through generations. And I thought I had put it all to bed. And I had adopted Caril's point of view. She had always really interested me as a person and as a child. I identified with her as a young girl in this situation, and I tried to imagine my whole life, really, how she could have gone along with him and how this could have happened. And the only point of view I had was this kind of muddled, she was along for the ride. She was part of this myth of these two Bonnie and Clyde types taking off across the countryside, killing everything they came across, all tangled up in love. But I've learned since writing this book that is a far cry from the truth, and that the myth has really been mixed up with the truth, this Hollywood version we have, and that these men from another time that we still quote about her. And my quest now has been to overcome those myths and find the seeds of the truth buried within them. And that's been my journey for the past 3 years since I appeared on a crime show, which was a weird experience, but I was a mother of 2 young children, and I thought I had put this crime aside, but I wasn't really working on much, and I had closed that door long ago, but on a whim I thought, well, maybe I'll do it this time. And the experience was eviscerating. It did nothing to expose the truth. It was just another iteration of the same myth and the mystery. How guilty was she innocent, or it left on this everything on this undecided point, and I was led to talk about how many times my grandmother had been stabbed, what was the timeline. It just was, it gave me nothing, and yet the experience gave me everything, because I began to research the crimes again to brush up for the show, and I discovered all these new things about the case. And one of them was this book called The 12th Victim. And I instantly read it, and I thought, this is such a large, complicated, and tragic story. And there are so many deeper tragedies and misinformation than I ever thought possible. And so I began, after reading The 12th Victim, which beautifully outlines and expresses the truth about Caril's journey, her youth, her innocence, and her hostage situation, which has been glamorized to this day. I discovered all these things and wanted not only to read the book, but to really explore the archives myself, to read the transcripts. Because my grandparents had died in this horrible way, I couldn't just read a book and then decide that she was innocent. I had to do all the research that the writers of the book, like Steve and Linda Battisti, had done themselves to prove to myself that this is what had really happened. And so I feel now that my duty as my grandparents' granddaughter is to show what the truth is, and to explore that, and to try to reach a larger audience about Caril, and overturn some myths.
You made a statement. You said the way that Caril was treated and our getting the truth out is symbolic or emblematic of a larger picture, and I really would like you to talk about that a little bit.
Well, it seems to me we're in a time of truth and overturning false convictions. We're more forward thinking, I would like to think, than we were back in the 50s. And we know so much more about a 14-year-old's brain and how they think and how easily they are traumatized. I feel that it's our duty as modern, forward-thinking people to overturn this myth and to understand that this was a situation in which a young girl was held hostage and had no control over this mad killer shooting people in front of her. And it's very timely today with a lot of movements that are going on, and it's so clear now that she was an innocent victim. If one were to go through the archives themselves, the way I have with a fine-toothed comb, they would find several instances of a mishandling of justice, and Caril seems like a person who deserves that chance. It's a very timely story. It's a very important story. It's about changing preconceived notions that have existed throughout this country and beyond for 60 years. And it needs to be done. And it needs to be done soon, because Caril doesn't have much time left. And even if this doesn't happen, or even if her pardon isn't heard before she dies, my greatest hope is that we will change people's minds, and this will become something larger. And even if she doesn't get to hear it, you will know, or we will all know, that what we thought was truth was not truth, and the way we behaved towards a little girl was not just. And that is something larger than, a gesture of pardon could be. I did write a letter for her pardon. It was very hard for me to do. I had to talk to my father about it, and he said, well, if it's well done, I approve this. you can do this, if you believe this, you've done this research, I'm willing, you should stand up for what you believe. And it's been, 2 years since I wrote that letter, and nothing has happened thus far. I would really like to see something happen, but if it doesn't, in the event that it doesn't, I would just like people to know the truth.
Well, some people talk the talk, you walk the walk. You've come here to Lincoln. It's an inconvenience to you, and I don't think it's emotionally that easy for you. But you want to speak for Caril, you want to advocate for her, and you have done so and are doing so in a number of ways, and we don't have to discuss all the ways. We can, insofar as you're comfortable doing so, whatever your current projects are. But you want truth for Caril in the same way that you want to accomplish something as part of the movement. There are a lot of movements there's a kind of confluence. I mean, people talk about the Me Too movement, they talk about several other movements. What do you see as some of the forces that are converging into a voice for women, complete and real equality?
Gosh, that would take some thought.
It's an unfair question, and I probably should have written it out last night, but
I do have a personal reaction.
Yeah, anything you can tell us.
Well, I feel like my family's truth is all wrapped up in her truth. So for me to stop being in pain over all of this, for my father to face this however he can in some small way, a gesture of truth or forgiveness is really the only good thing that can come out of this terrible crime. And for me, as the mother of a daughter, I would like to make sure that her voice is heard and that she has all the information to be a powerful young woman in the world and to be able to stand up for herself, to say no, to believe in herself enough to know that her instincts are right, and to not go along with everything he says out of terror and having been taught to be a submissive.
I have always tried to hunger and thirst after righteousness' sake. I have always had a sense of justice, which is what led me to Vietnam and which is what forced me to write this book, and which has somehow been a part of my becoming friends with you, because you also are seeking justice. My justice seeking tends to be tunnel vision. I think you're more of in your way, a big picture person, in that you have your own quest, your own pursuit, and yet you see a much larger picture. And so when you're advocating for Caril, you are in your way advocating for womanhood, as I understand it.
I'm advocating for womanhood, and I'm advocating for the safety of 14-year-old girls in our world. And I'm advocating for a safe place for a girl to live, and to not, to be able to trust her voice and to stand up for herself, and to be able to identify when she's being taken advantage of. I don't know that Caril was given the opportunity to even see that was happening before suddenly a guy that she had once dated and already broken up with and told to go away, and who would not accept no for an answer. She was not given the opportunity to see that he was behind a door with a gun when she got home from school, which not everybody knows. They think she contributed to her parents' killing, which if you look at the timelines and you look at all the documents, that's completely and utterly false. Her school records show a perfect attendance. I just would like a safer world for young girls.
You have overcome, and it's kind of a complicated thing, but a person once told me there is such a thing as free choice. But in order to be in a position to exercise free choice, you have to understand and be able to combat both the personal and historical forces working on you. It seems to me that you have had to, in your way, combat personal forces. There was a subject that was so painful for your family that they were unable to express it without hurting themselves, and they feared hurting you. And so for this reason, you had to have a quest for truth, and you had to go against the atmosphere that your parents thought would be safest for you. And so every step you've taken in your advocacy of Caril has been with concern over family members. You have not wanted to hurt any member of your family. You knew that from their point of view, just to leave the subject alone, which is what many Nebraskans want to do, just to leave the subject alone and not let the sun shine in, not let the truth come in, would be most comfortable for the people closest to you. And yet you have an overriding quest for truth and a sense of justice, which has to have brought you a great deal of discomfort.
Oh, absolutely. I feel this has been a very hard journey, and I've had to walk into some very dark places to find the truth and the rays of light, I guess. I've walked, into places where I felt unwelcome. I've asked difficult questions. I hid a lot of this from my family at first, what I was doing, what I was searching for. They didn't want to hear about it. They said, well, you wrote Outside Valentine, maybe now I don't know why everyone keeps talking about this crime and why you can't leave it alone. However, in the past few months, things have changed greatly for my family. My father says that he's proud of me, and my cousins here in Nebraska support my endeavors and have been willing to look at this myth in a new light and to possibly explore the truth themselves, which is an incredibly difficult thing for my family to do, and for them to give me their blessing felt just like I felt 1,000 pounds lighter. But it took a long time to get to this point, and it took a lot of research for me, and it took a lot of I felt like deceit to find the truth, which is such an odd combination. I mean, I felt almost in a strange way like I was having an affair with this crime, because it was like, no, so taboo to even go there. But out of this affair and out of this obsession came a great gift. And that great gift has been learning the truth about Caril. And I just want to share it with everyone.
When everything happened, I was in college in Palo Alto, California, very much immersed in my own world, and I was horrified to hear about these things, but that was about as far as it went. Like everybody else, I thought, well, the newspapers probably have it right, and the prosecutors probably know what they're doing, and so it doesn't concern me. No, I've always been good friends with Jim MacArthur, who was, he and his father advocated for Caril for years, and I had many conversations with him about her. And he said, I'd be very comfortable having her babysit my children, of course I would. And he told me about the time that she was, they were giving her little furloughs from her incarceration, and he allowed her to swim in the swimming pool of an apartment complex he owned, and somebody got upset, and then they started canceling things. I mean, any act of kindness to her was seen as an affront to the victims and their families. People who knew nothing about it said, well, if you say anything nice about her, you're going to hurt the feelings of Liza Ward. We didn't know her name, but the families of the victims. And I once told someone, once I got into it, after she had called my radio show, and I was so impressed with how open she was. And you talk to a person, even though I had not yet met her physically, not yet spent the hours together we spent and the conversations we taped. I had not done any of that, but I got a sense from a couple hours talking to her on the air that she was telling the truth. You can't spend a whole lot of time in the courtroom and time in war without getting a sense of people who were authentic. And I was deeply touched by her. And then Linda Battisti was in town, and Jim MacArthur called me and said, you ought to have her on your radio show. So I did. And her passion, her absolute conviction that Caril was innocent was contagious. And she and I discussed the notion, I had a book out that had done fairly well, of my becoming a co-author with her. And I said, yeah, let me meet her. And the next time she's in Lincoln, let me talk with her. And from what you tell me and from the record as I read it, I think I could get on board. Well, one conversation with Caril in person, face to face, and I had her meet Margaret. Of course, I was absolutely convinced that she was telling the truth. Absolutely. Now, here's the interesting thing about her telling the truth. Side stories, Liza, today's a day for side stories. When I practiced law in New York City, it was with Henry Rothblatt, and he partnered with F. Lee Bailey on some books on how to try criminal cases, and a lot of high-profile cases, and they both used a polygrapher named Cleve Baxter, who was a pretty good polygrapher. Well, Lee Bailey decided he'd have a television show called Lie Detector, so he did. So he invited Caril on. This was long before I met her. And it was his hope to prove that she was lying when she said she was a captive and a victim and innocent. So she took the test and she passed it. So she took it again and she passed it. So she took it again and she passed it. Poor old F. Lee Bailey couldn't prove that she was a liar because she was telling the truth. She's also subjected herself to psychoanalytical procedures, deep hypnosis, anything you name, it's always the same. She was and is telling the truth. And the fact that Starkweather admitted that he had done all the killings up until the time that the sheriff coerced her to write a note saying she didn't want to see him, up until that, and Starkweather changed his mind and convicted her on his way to the electric chair. She was telling the truth all the time. When she escaped him, and she ran in a zigzag pattern because she knew he might shoot her, and got into a cop car and said that Charles Starkweather, what was that? That was her doom. 14-year-old girl, let's railroad her, lock her up for life. That'll interest the readers of the local newspapers. And that's what happened. She was good old boyed right into the pen. And I do not like good old boy networks, either in the court system or, as it happens, in various church systems. We've evolved now. Now, the Lincoln police, I gotta say this, are clean, good people. The cops I deal with and have dealt with impress me mightily. And the current group of prosecutors are a clean bunch, both state and federal. But there was a time when the philosophy was, these are bad guys, let's get them convicted no matter what we have to do, because we're the good guys. That was the philosophy. And you read the record, you read the things we've set forth in our book. Margaret and I, by the way, a couple people from the British Broadcasting Corporation were here doing something about Caril. And they asked Margaret and me to drive him around to all the places, so we did. And I know, and as it happened, it was in the evening when we did this kind of a spooky deal. For you, it must have been more than just spooky. And of course, you have gone into the house where your grandfather and grandmother and their maid were murdered. You have been in that house.
I spent my summers there as a child, never knowing that that was where it happened. So I'm very familiar. I have the house in Lincoln for me. I have so many different layers of experience. First, I was a child and I knew nothing, and the house felt like a very happy and welcoming and grand structure. And then much later I learned that that was where all these murders had occurred. And so I already knew about the murders, but I had placed them in this mansion somewhere, which I don't know where that is in Lincoln. Some mysterious big mansion that doesn't really exist in Lincoln. But I was then able to place the crime in my mind, place all the people and all the objects. And that was just a profound experience for me to have that innocent childhood, and then a later visiting the house as that no longer was in my family, and coming as almost a voyeur myself now, and trying to thinking not of those happy times, but of, was this the room where she died? Was this the room, the spot on the floor near the front door where he was shot? And it's a strange feeling to have. I can only imagine how my father must have felt having to go back to that house and live there after the crimes. And
yeah, that is astonishing to me. I suppose he kept the house as a kind of connection.
I mean, that was the way things were dealt with. I think in looking at this case, we also have to understand that there was a particular mindset at the time, which is no longer the common mindset or the way we deal with things. And that we have to understand that this wasn't a time of speaking about things. It was not a time of expressing emotions. It was a time of dusting up and moving on. And that was the way you dealt with things. And we've learned since then that that's not always the best way to deal with things. But that was how my father dealt with it, and how his aunt and uncle dealt with it, and it was thought to be best for him, and it possibly, added to the sense that he couldn't look at anything, and he had to move on and make himself into his own person to survive, and to get as far away from Lincoln as possible, really. Because everywhere he looked here, someone was talking about it. He remembers at his parents' funeral, photographers standing on the gravestones taking photographs. I mean, his whole experience with the media has been one of opposition. And so that brings me to a story which I feel is really important for me to voice and express. And it's a very good example of the kind of thing that happens to create a myth such as this. When I was doing the research for my crime show, I came upon an article or a newspaper online, and I don't remember the name of the newspaper. It was a very small town paper, but it had a story about a man who had found some crime scene photographs of my grandparents in a wall. And among the photographs, he also had files, which the article clearly states made it very clear that Caril was guilty. And her strange behavior in this diner. And then there was an editorial in that same paper about, ew, by the editor of this paper, what would it have been like to meet her on a dating site? I mean, it was absolutely disgusting. So I went and saw this man who had these photographs in rural Nebraska. I looked at the files, which were the ones that clearly said she was guilty. And what was clear to me from reading these files, that there was a terrified little girl walking into a diner, staring at the woman behind the counter because she wanted to get a message across to her that she was too afraid to say. And I cannot believe how someone could write an article stating that, having actually read that file. And I just think that's how it's possible that he never read the file or thought it would make a better story if it was, clear that she was guilty, because lots of people do think that makes a better story. It makes a better screenplay, makes a better book, a novel, if her situation and her behavior is nebulous. But I thought that was incredibly telling, and I need to say it because I feel like that may have happened.
That was where it was, though. The thing was, the chorus, Caril is guilty. She should have been on his lap when he was electrocuted, and so forth. That was the chorus. Some people did it for money, some people did it because it made them feel good, and it interests me. Why? Why is Charles Starkweather such a folk hero, this vicious murderer, that people are proud to be able to quote him?
I don't know if they realize sometimes that they're quoting him. I mean, there are quotes online that you can find, but I feel like a lot of times people don't even know where their words come from. And it's about misinformation, and it's about setting the record straight. I think that anyone who is presented with the truth, most people anyway, are willing to change their minds. It's just a matter of getting the right information in front of them and allowing them to draw their own conclusions about it.
Well, James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause, and Starkweather kind of tried to affect that personality, tried to have the cigarette dangling from the mouth and all the... Yeah. He was basically, whoever and whatever he was, whatever his problems, he was a positive force of evil. Sometimes evil is just not doing the right thing, but there are actual forces of evil. That's where Thomas Aquinas and I part ways. He says evil is just the absence of good. I have seen evil. I've seen it in the battlefield. I've seen it in the courtroom. I have seen real evil, and you have too. And it exists. And the evil that was Charles Starkweather, in his destruction of Caril is propagated by people who think they are good citizens. And I could give you a couple of examples. Margaret and I have been invited to places where I give small readings and discuss my book. And one I was at, one woman, I explained where we were, and one woman stood up. They were all very nice to me, except for one woman who stood up and said, well, I was a 14-year-old girl, and I have a 14-year-old daughter, and we knew right from wrong. And of course I didn't say, well, gee, I'm sure you handled it well when someone pointed a shotgun at you and threatened to have your parents killed. I didn't say anything like that because I knew this is going to happen. And the hostess walked me out to the car and she said, well, she's a little peculiar. And I said, I understand. This is going to happen in any crowd I'm in. I appeared on that Lifetime Learning series, and it was very nice. And Jim MacArthur appeared with me, and it went very well. One woman stood up at the end and said to me, well, I know some things. And I said, please tell me anything you know, because the quest for truth, the book has been written, but the quest for truth is unending. Tell me anything you know. Well, I just know some things. Okay. Well, glad you knew some things. But we are surrounded by people who know some things. Well, they just don't know what they are.
Well, I feel, I have, my views are, I swing one way 1 minute and one the next. I always, in my heart, know she's innocent. But I think when I meet people, they expect me to think a certain way. And they say, well, of course she was guilty and you might want to do this or you might want to do that. And it's just, it's interesting to hear their assumptions about what I think because of who I am and what happened. And I believe that they're trying to soothe me, and they do believe that they know what they're talking about. But it's usually just something that they've heard, and it's not based on facts, transcripts, things like that.
Yeah, when I think of the polygraphers, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, and see, they said in the courtroom, well, she didn't come across very well. Of course she didn't. She was a terrified girl who had been brutalized first by a mass murderer, and secondly, by our law enforcement system and by the court system. And yeah, she came across badly. In fact, I even quoted, you'll remember in this book, a psychologist who said that if she had been properly treated, there's no jury in the world that would have convicted her. But she sat there in a state of shock. And people said, well, you could tell she was just a smart aleck, and the jury didn't like her. She was a terrified girl.
Well, they wanted her to break into tears. And, she didn't do that because she had always been taught that that's not the face you put on things when you're in trouble. You try to be brave. And I think that face, she was convicted on strange details, and she was convicted on her expression in photographs. And I that's just the way we are as a nation. And you look at someone's expression in a photograph and you think you know what they're thinking, and really it's just how you've been taught to face the camera.
Well, and in her childhood, she had some abusive treatment that also taught her to act in as stoical a manner as she could. And then, the whole thing about the Christmas tree being knocked over and all those stories that we discussed. And Linda particularly spent so many hours and did so many tapes with Caril, and I spent some hours and did some tapes. And this wasn't easy for Caril to talk about either, by the way. She was exhausted, and I said, I'm sorry, I know I'm pushing you. Here's a few things to think about, and before we meet tomorrow. And she and her husband came back, and he told me she had burst into tears and tore my notes up. and there was nothing particular provocative in them. It was just that cooperating with me, cooperating with Linda, was stressful to her in ways that even though we were trying to help, we could not have foreseen.
Yeah, and the fact that she always thought her parents were hostages and that everything she did to keep them alive, to only find out at the end of all this that they were dead all that time. And she said the only thing I feel bad about or that I did wrong was believing everything he told me.
And I have the letter, a copy somewhere of the letter she wrote them saying, "Why haven't you come to visit me?" I mean, people, she didn't know if they were alive or dead, because the same people that lied to her that they were going to protect her, then locked her up, then they said, "Now your parents are dead." She didn't know if they were alive or dead. I mean, she was treated. Can you imagine this today if a girl ran in a zigzag pattern to a cop car and said, "There's the mass murderer, you've got to get him, please protect me," breaks into sobs, that all I can think about is, yeah, let's get her convicted.
No, they would have thought of Elizabeth Smart Bell and many other women, young girls who have been, I mean, that was different entirely, but
Yeah.
all of these things now are in our
Yeah,
consciousness.
you go into that a little more.
Oh, I don't know if I can.
Oh,
but
okay.
but I mean, that we've seen this situation in modern times with girls her age who are suffering from trauma and who cannot react or don't feel that they have choices because there's someone with a gun to their head or they're being brainwashed. Or I don't know that she was never brainwashed. I don't, this happened within a very short period, and B, she seemed to always know that she was dealing with someone very dangerous. I just think that now we have, if she ran to that police car, that police man or woman would have a completely different list of situations, cases, and crimes in the mind that would say immediately that she deserves our protection.
We talk about this, and I once told someone I could get into a bar fight anywhere in Lincoln just by saying something nice about Caril Fugate. Not that I'm a little old to get into bar fights, don't misunderstand me. But there was just this hostility still dwells toward her, and the truth is out there. We've put it out there, put a little time and effort into it. Nobody can connect the dots. Well, yes, she passed all the polygraphs. Well, yes, Starkweather convicted her on his way to the electric chair after saying she was innocent. Well, yes, psychologists and psychiatrists now say that she was telling the truth but couldn't present herself properly to the jury. Well, yes, we broke all the constitutional rules because it was before Miranda, before Gideon versus Wainwright, before Escobedo, before any of the cases that changed the law and decided that maybe when the Sixth Amendment said people are entitled to assistance of counsel, gee, maybe that's true. What happened is that somebody figured out that the Bill of Rights applied to state court, not just federal court, but state court. And it did because of the language of the 14th Amendment. Now, this all happened during the 60s, which, by the way, I was in law school at the time. What an exciting time to be in law school. All those interesting cases about the 4th, 5th, 6th Amendment. The laws changed and evolved so rapidly, but all of this happened to her before then. But still, there was a juvenile court. There were lawyers that would work for free. Merrill Roller wanted to participate in the trial. He was a very good lawyer. He sat there, and Harry Spencer wouldn't let him open his mouth. Harry got rewarded, of course, by being on the Nebraska Supreme Court. Everybody who persecuted Caril Fugate got rewarded. Well, and I guess the people that wrote the articles that said they've seen absolute truth that she was guilty. They made a few bucks on it, I suppose. I don't know. There is the notion that truth at some point will emerge. And yet, you and I have been working pretty hard at it for a long time. And maybe we're budging it a little, do you suppose?
Yeah, I hope so. That's our greatest wish.
I've mentioned before that we are being filmed at the Berry Law Firm. This is not a Berry Law Firm presentation. I'm here as an author. Liza's here as an author. We're saying our own things. We're not representing the opinions of anybody else in this firm, but this is a place where I can go to get things filmed, and that's what I'm doing, because Liza is in town, and Margaret and I are so delighted to have her company. And Liza mentioned that the clock is running on Caril. It's running on me too. I'm 80 years old, and there are things a man wants to get done. And there are truths that maybe a man wants to get out. And for that reason, the law firm has been kind enough to afford me this opportunity to record anything I want to say and anything Liza wants to say, because it's our statement. And so we're here, and I don't want to push you about your plans or your projects, but I do want you to leave here thinking that you've said everything you want to say.
I'm always the sort of person who thinks on things and then comes up with them later, so I could be shouting things out in my sleep. I'm sure I haven't said everything I want to say, but I'd like to. I think in my next project, I probably will be able to say everything I want to say in the way I can say it. And I think the truth is much better than the fiction that we've always been telling ourselves about this.
You know, that is so true. First of all, you're a good writer, once again. Fine novel, good articles. Secondly, you have the courage, and I don't know who I'm quoting, but it said, it takes one kind of courage to walk into the battlefield. It takes a very different courage to walk into the fires of your own heart. And that's what you are doing. And that's what you have done right here. And you've been brave enough and generous enough to allow me to record this. I don't know who's going to see this. Maybe I can get people to show it, to distribute it. But and maybe you will use it for some reason, some purposes. But it is a need for truth. You mentioned you'll think of other things. You know the expression esprit d'escalier. You know, the French say that's the spirit of the staircase. As you walk down the stairs, you think of what you should have said.
Well, I'm like that very much. But I want to thank you for helping so much to lead me in this direction, which feels like a really important step in my life and my family's journey and our relationship to the past. And I'm just really grateful for the doors that you've helped open, and your fight, and we need it. And it's really a wonderful gift to be sitting here with you.
Well, I will be fighting for the truth about Caril as long as I can breathe in and out. And even if she passes, you mentioned that her health isn't the best right now. I'm not going to let up, and neither are you, because we can't. In the final analysis, now I'm going to quote Picasso. Somebody said to him, "You're in your mid-80s, you're as wealthy as a man can be. Why are you still painting?" And he said, "If there is something you can do, and you don't do it, you become a ghost. And neither you nor I are quite ready to achieve ghosthood. I'm quite a bit older than you are, and you have more years than I do. But between the two of us, we will continue to work for the truth. And it is a beacon. It is a guiding beacon. It's irresistible. It draws you. And the truth about somebody's innocence, the truth about a young girl who is no longer young and not in very good health right now, the truth has to come out. And I do not know why people enjoy further victimization of Caril, but I do know that you and I will not stop.
No.
Liza, I'm thinking that you and I have done what we set out to do. We've made a record here, taking advantage of your time in Lincoln. I'm so glad you're here, and Margaret and I enjoy your company so much. Once again, Liza is a novelist. She's an essayist. She writes and publishes short stories. And by publishing, I mean she writes them and somebody pays her and then they publish them. I don't mean neither you nor I are into into publishing our own work. I think that your voice will be heard, and I think it will be heard for a long time. And aside from the pleasure of your company, I have felt that our conversations about Caril were important enough that they should be preserved, and that's why I was able to prevail on the law firm just to let us, not as a law firm project, but you and me, to sit here and record this. Now, I used to have a radio show, I told you that, and I had a sign-off, and it was to Wagner's Flying Dutchman, and here's how I signed off. I am John Stevens Barry, reminding you that the torch burns, the flame endures, the human spirit will prevail. I believe that, Liza.